She stood in my backyard with a clipboard, telling me my patio didn't belong to me anymore. She called it community property, shared space, something every homeowner had the legal right to use whenever they pleased. She even brought HOA board members to witness it. I didn't argue. I walked inside, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folded property map I hadn't touched in 6 years. Less than 2 minutes later, the meeting was over. The board stopped talking. Karen stopped smiling, and everyone standing in my backyard realized they'd just made one very expensive mistake. I bought my house in Ashworth Green 6 years ago, drawn in mostly by the backyard. It wasn't huge, but it backed up to a quiet stretch of trees. Private enough that I could sit out there most evenings without seeing a single neighbor. Just birds and the occasional deer wandering along the tree line. I'd spent 2 summers building a stone patio back there myself, one paver at a time, along with a small pergola I put up the following spring. It became the one part of the house that felt entirely mine, in a neighborhood where almost everything else came with some kind of rule attached to it. Ashworth Green is a mid-sized community of just under 300 homes, built around a shared network of walking trails, a small pond, and a clubhouse that hosts the occasional potluck or holiday event. It's the kind of place that looks perfectly pleasant from the outside. Tidy lawns and matching mailbox posts, and, for the most part, it actually is. I've never had a serious problem with our HOA. I pay my dues, I follow the parking rules. I've never once been fined for anything in 6 years of living here. Our HOA board has been run for the last 3 years by a woman named Karen Ellison, a retired schoolteacher who moved into the neighborhood not long before she was elected board president. Karen is the kind of person who genuinely believes she's improving the community with every decision she makes, and to be fair, some of what she's done actually has. She organized the repaving of our main walking trail. She pushed through a much-needed update to our irrigation system after 2 consecutive dry summers. I never disliked Karen. I actually respected a lot of what she did in those first couple of years. What I didn't fully appreciate, until much more recently, was how expansive Karen's definition of community had slowly become. It started, as far as I can piece together, with a genuine mapping error the HOA management company made when digitizing the community's old paper plat records about 2 years ago. In converting decades-old surveys into a modern GIS system, several individual property lines along the tree-lined edge of the neighborhood, including mine, got redrawn slightly differently than they'd originally been recorded, folding small slivers of privately owned backyard space into what the new digital map labeled as shared green space. Nobody actually verified this against the original recorded plats. The new map simply became the map everyone used going forward, myself included, since I had no reason at the time to think anything about my own property had changed. I didn't think much of it either, mostly because for the better part of 2 years, nothing about my daily life actually changed. I kept using my patio. I kept maintaining my pergola. Nobody said a word to me about any of it, and I had no idea the ground beneath my own stone pavers had technically, on paper somewhere in a filing cabinet at the management office, been quietly reclassified as something that wasn't entirely mine anymore. What I also didn't know was that Karen had recently begun championing a new community initiative, an ambitious plan to expand the neighborhood's walking trail network by connecting several disconnected sections along that same tree-lined edge of the community, the exact stretch where my backyard happened to sit. I found out about the initiative the same way most of Ashworth Green did, through a community newsletter that arrived in my mailbox describing an exciting new project to reclaim and connect underutilized shared green spaces for the benefit of all residents. I remember reading it standing at my own mailbox, thinking vaguely that it sounded like a nice idea for somebody else's section of the neighborhood, with absolutely no idea that the newsletter in my hand was describing my own backyard. I had no idea, standing there that afternoon, that a mapping error 2 years in the making was about to walk directly up to my patio, clipboard in hand, and inform me that the stone pavers under my own 2 feet weren't actually mine at all. Karen showed up at my house on a Saturday morning in early spring, clipboard in hand, a rolled-up printout tucked under one arm. I remember being mildly surprised to see her at my door at all, since in 6 years she'd never once had a reason to knock. She was polite at first, complimenting the pergola, asking how long I'd had the patio in. I told her, proudly, that I'd built most of it myself over 2 summers. She nodded along, jotting something on her clipboard, and then asked if she could walk through the backyard with me for a moment. That's when she unrolled the printout. It was a section of the community's new digital plat map. My own property, outlined in blue, with a shaded green overlay stretching directly across my patio and roughly a third of my backyard, labeled in small printed text as Shared Community Green Space, Trail Expansion Zone 3. I laughed, genuinely, assuming for a moment this had to be some kind of mistake. Karen didn't laugh back. She explained, calmly and with the practiced patience of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this exact conversation, that according to the HOA's updated records, a portion of my backyard had always been designated as shared green space, and that the upcoming trail expansion initiative would be extending a public walking path directly through that section, connecting it to the wooded trail system behind several other homes. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, how a portion of my backyard, the same portion I'd personally paved with my own hands 6 years ago, could possibly be shared community land. She told me the HOA's updated GIS mapping system, implemented 2 years earlier, reflected the community's accurate and legally recorded boundaries, and that if I had concerns, I was welcome to bring supporting documentation to the next board meeting. I remember standing there in my own backyard, in front of my own pergola, being told I needed to bring documentation to prove that my patio actually belonged to me. I called the HOA management office on Monday morning, expecting, the way I imagine most people do in situations like this, that a simple phone call would clear up an obvious clerical error. Instead, I got a woman who read me the exact same explanation Karen had given me, referencing the same updated plat map, the same GIS conversion project from 2 years earlier, with no acknowledgement whatsoever that anything about it might be worth double-checking. I asked to see the original paper plat records the new map had supposedly been digitized from. She told me those records were archived off-site and would take several weeks to retrieve. I spent that same afternoon digging through my own closet, pulling out the folder of paperwork from my house closing 6 years earlier, the one I'd shoved in a drawer and mostly forgotten about since. I found my property survey, completed as part of the closing process, clearly showing my backyard boundary extending well past where my patio sat, with no green space designation anywhere on the document. I brought that survey to the HOA office in person the following day. The woman behind the desk looked at it, looked at her computer screen and told me, almost apologetically, that she wasn't authorized to make any determination on boundary disputes, that only the board could formally review conflicting documentation, and that my best option was to submit a written request to appear at the next scheduled meeting. The next scheduled meeting was 5 weeks away. In the meantime, the Trail Expansion Initiative kept moving forward. I received a second newsletter 2 weeks later, this one considerably more detailed, including a rendered map of the proposed trail route, complete with a small dotted line running directly through the exact section of my backyard Karen had shown me on her printout. The newsletter cheerfully invited residents to attend a community input session to share their excitement about the project. He attended that input session, mostly out of a mounting sense of disbelief. It was held in the clubhouse, maybe 30 homeowners scattered across folding chairs, Karen standing at the front near a large printed version of the same trail map. I raised my hand at one point and asked, as neutrally as I could manage, whether any of the proposed trail route crossed privately owned backyards. Karen answered without hesitation that the entire route followed designated shared green space according to the community's official records, and that any homeowner with documentation suggesting otherwise was welcome to raise it through the proper channels. I raised my hand again and mentioned, directly, that my own property survey showed my backyard boundary extending well beyond where the proposed trail was drawn. Karen's response, delivered with the same calm, teacherly patience she'd used at my own patio weeks earlier, was that individual property surveys sometimes used outdated reference points, and that the HOA's updated GIS system had been specifically implemented to correct exactly that kind of discrepancy community-wide. I left that meeting with a distinct, uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't actually being heard so much as being managed, gently and repeatedly redirected back toward a process that seemed designed to run out the clock rather than resolve anything. I called a land surveyor the following week, a methodical man named Gregory Ashford who'd worked in the county for over 15 years. I gave him my closing survey and asked him to independently verify my property boundary against the county's official recorded plat, not the HOA's internal digital version, but the actual legal record filed with the county recorder's office. Gregory's findings came back 9 days later, and they confirmed exactly what I'd suspected since Karen first unrolled that printout in my backyard. My property boundary, according to the county's officially recorded plat, extended a full 18 feet beyond where the HOA's new GIS map had drawn the shared green space line. My patio and the majority of my pergola sat entirely within my own legally recorded property, with no shared designation of any kind attached to it, now or ever. The error, Gregory explained, appeared to be a fairly common mistake made during large-scale digital conversions of old paper records, where a scanning or referencing mistake shifts a boundary line slightly across an entire section of a map, rather than affecting just one property in isolation. He suspected, based on the shape of the shaded green space overlay Karen had shown me, that this same error likely affected several other homes along that same tree-lined edge of the neighborhood. Not just mine. That detail sat with me for the rest of that evening. If Gregory was right, this wasn't simply a mistake about my backyard. It was a mistake that had potentially, quietly, reclassified pieces of multiple families' private property as shared community land, all without a single one of us being formally notified that anything had changed. I thought about the newsletter sitting on my kitchen counter, the one cheerfully inviting residents to celebrate a trail expansion that was, according to an independent county-verified survey, actually planned to run directly through privately owned backyards that the HOA had simply never bothered to double-check. Thought about the 5 weeks I still had left before my scheduled turn to speak at a board meeting. Weeks during which the trail expansion initiative, as far as I could tell, wasn't planning to slow down even slightly. I called my attorney that same night. Sandra Klein called me back 2 days after I sent her everything, Gregory's report included, and the first thing she told me was that she wanted her own team to independently verify Gregory's findings before we did anything else. I appreciated the caution, even as it meant another agonizing week of waiting. Her firm's review confirmed exactly what Gregory had found, and then went further than I expected. Sandra had requested county plat records for every property along that same tree-lined edge of Ashworth Green, not just mine, and cross-referenced each one against the HOA's new digital GIS map. What came back confirmed Gregory's suspicion in the worst possible way. 7 homes, including mine, showed the exact same boundary shift, each one losing a strip of private backyard to the HOA's shared green space overlay, each one falling directly along the proposed trail expansion route. Sandra sent a formal letter to the HOA board within the week, addressed to Karen Ellison directly, copying the entire board and the management company's legal counsel. The letter laid out the discrepancy in plain terms. 7 privately owned properties, verified against official county records, incorrectly reclassified as shared community land due to an unverified digital conversion error. A planned trail expansion route running directly through that same reclassified land. And a formal demand that the project be immediately paused pending a full independent review of the community's boundary data. I didn't hear back through official channels. I heard back through my neighbor, a woman 2 doors down named Priscilla Hart, who called me the same evening Sandra's letter arrived at the HOA office, asking, with more than a little alarm in her voice, whether I knew anything about her own backyard supposedly being part of some new trail project. Priscilla's property, it turned out, was one of the 7. Over the following days, I heard from 3 more homeowners along that same stretch, each of them contacted directly by Priscilla once she realized what was happening. Each of them equally unaware that a mapping error 2 years earlier had quietly redrawn the boundaries of the very land their homes sat on. None of us had been individually notified. None of us had any reason to suspect anything had changed. Right up until Karen's trail expansion initiative started drawing dotted lines across our own backyards in a community newsletter. The scheduled board meeting arrived on a Tuesday evening, though by that point it had grown into something considerably larger than the quiet 5-minute slot I'd originally been allotted. Word had spread through those 7 households, and by the time I walked into the clubhouse with Sandra beside me, I counted at least 40 homeowners filling the folding chairs, far more than I'd seen at any Ashworth Green meeting before. Karen stood at the front near the same printed trail map from the input session weeks earlier, though I noticed her composure seemed thinner now, her eyes tracking the unusually full room with something that looked less like her usual calm authority and more like quiet unease. Sandra spoke first, laying out the discrepancy exactly as she had in her letter. 7 properties, a verified boundary error, a trail expansion route drawn directly through reclassified private land. She held up Gregory's county-verified survey alongside the HOA's own GIS printout, the 2 boundary lines visibly, undeniably different by 18 feet. I watched the room shift the way rooms do when people realize something affects them personally rather than abstractly. Priscilla stood up almost immediately, confirming that her own property survey showed the same discrepancy. 2 more homeowners from that same stretch stood up after her, one of them holding his own closing paperwork, visibly frustrated that he'd never been told any of this. Karen attempted to hold her position, repeating the same explanation she'd given me in my backyard weeks earlier, insisting the HOA's GIS system reflected accurate, updated community records. But the room wasn't asking her to explain the system anymore. They were asking her why 7 families had never been individually notified that their own backyards had apparently been reclassified, why an entire trail expansion initiative had been publicly promoted for months without anyone verifying the underlying property lines it depended on. That's when one of the other board members, a quiet, deliberate man named Frank Delacroix, who'd served alongside Karen for 2 years without ever drawing much attention to himself, asked a question that shifted the entire tone of that meeting. He asked Karen directly whether the trail expansion grant application she'd submitted to the county's Parks Improvement Fund 6 months earlier had included documentation confirming that all necessary land access had already been secured. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't heard it go quiet before. Karen's answer came slowly, carefully, in a tone that had lost most of its earlier composure. She confirmed that yes, the grant application had included a signed statement confirming all trail route land was either community-owned or covered by existing easement agreements, a statement required to qualify for the county's expedited funding track. Frank asked the follow-up question everyone in that room was clearly thinking. Had that statement been accurate at the time she signed it, given that at least 7 properties along the route were, according to 2 independently verified surveys, privately owned with no easement agreement in place at all? Karen didn't answer that question directly. She said something about relying on the management company's updated records in good faith, that she'd had no reason to doubt the accuracy of data the HOA itself had commissioned. Sandra, still standing at the front with both surveys in hand, pointed out, calmly and without raising her voice even slightly, that a signed grant application containing inaccurate statements about secured land access wasn't simply an internal HOA matter anymore. It was a matter that potentially involved the County Parks Department directly, since public grant funding had been awarded based on that signed statement. I watched Karen's face in that exact moment. The same calm, teacherly composure she'd carried into my backyard weeks earlier, finally giving way to something else entirely. Something closer to the realization that this had stopped being a conversation about property lines and had become something with consequences considerably larger than a walking trail. The board voted that same night 6-1, Karen casting the lone dissenting vote to immediately suspend the trail expansion project pending a full independent boundary review of every property along the proposed route, and to formally notify the County Parks Department of the discrepancy in the grant application before any further funds were disbursed. I walked out of that clubhouse with Sandra beside me, my original survey still folded in my jacket pocket, exactly the way I'd carried it into my own backyard confrontation with Karen weeks earlier. I had no idea, standing in that parking lot watching Priscilla and the other affected homeowners exchange numbers and promises to stay in touch, that the county's response to Karen's grant application was about to turn a paused walking trail into something that would end her position on that board entirely. The County Parks Department's response arrived faster than any of us expected, and it arrived with considerably more weight than a simple acknowledgement of an internal HOA dispute. Within 2 weeks of the board's formal notification, Ashworth Green received a letter from the County Parks Improvement Fund's compliance office, informing the HOA that the grant application Karen had signed 6 months earlier was being placed under formal review. The letter noted, in the same plain, unemotional language Sandra had used in her own correspondence, that grant funding awarded based on inaccurate representations of secured land access constituted a material breach of the funding agreement, and that the HOA would need to either resolve the underlying property disputes and resubmit accurate documentation, or return the disbursed funds in full. The amount in question, it turned out, was considerably larger than any of us had realized while sitting in that clubhouse weeks earlier. The county had already advanced $62,000 toward the trail expansion project, funds that had been used for preliminary engineering work, permitting fees, and a deposit toward the contractor who'd been scheduled to begin construction the following month. Frank Delacroix, who'd asked the question that first cracked open Karen's composure that night, was appointed to chair a newly formed review committee tasked with sorting through the mess. He requested full copies of every communication between the HOA and the management company regarding the GIS conversion project, going back to its original implementation 2 years earlier. What that review uncovered wasn't quite as dramatic as some of the darker theories homeowners had started floating in the weeks since that meeting, but it was damaging in its own quieter way. The GIS conversion, it turned out, had been rushed through by the previous management company under a discounted, expedited contract Karen herself had negotiated during her first year as board president, specifically to save the HOA money compared to a more thorough, properly verified conversion process that would have cost nearly 3 times as much and taken the better part of a year longer. Karen had, in effect, approved a cut corner 2 years earlier that nobody had thought to question until it collided directly with an ambitious trail expansion project she'd personally championed, a project that depended entirely on property lines nobody had ever gone back to verify. I don't believe, even now, that Karen set out to take anyone's backyard. I think she genuinely believed the updated map was accurate, the same way I think she genuinely believed expanding the community's trail system was a good idea worth pursuing quickly. But belief without verification, I've come to understand through all of this, doesn't actually protect anyone once the consequences of being wrong start landing on other people's property. The second board meeting, called specifically to address Frank's findings, was even more crowded than the first. Karen resigned before the meeting formally began, submitting a written statement to the full board that acknowledged, for the first time since this entire dispute started, that the GIS conversion process she'd approved 2 years earlier hadn't been properly verified against original county records, and that she took responsibility for the trail expansion project moving forward without that verification ever happening. It wasn't quite an apology in the way I might have wanted, standing in my own backyard weeks earlier being told my patio belonged to everyone. But it was, I'll admit, more accountability than I expected to get. The 7 affected homeowners, myself included, received formal written corrections to our property records within the month, along with a joint letter from the HOA's new interim leadership confirming that our original boundaries, verified against county records, would be permanently reflected in any future digital mapping the community undertook. The trail expansion project itself wasn't scrapped entirely, which honestly surprised me. Frank's committee worked with a licensed engineering firm to redesign the route entirely within confirmed community-owned land, adding a modest detour around our properties that added maybe 4 minutes to the walk but required exactly 0 backyards that weren't actually the HOA's to use. The County Parks Department, satisfied with the corrected documentation and the redesigned route, allowed the grant to proceed rather than demanding a full refund, though the HOA was required to submit quarterly compliance reports for the following 2 years, a level of oversight Frank told me privately he didn't mind at all, given how badly the alternative could have gone. Karen's departure from the board happened quietly in the end, without the kind of dramatic final confrontation I might have expected weeks earlier, watching her face lose its composure in that packed clubhouse. She simply stopped attending meetings, and a few months later put her house up for sale. I heard, secondhand through Priscilla, that she'd moved to a smaller community across the county, one without a trail expansion project or, presumably, 7 backyards she'd need to double-check before claiming them for anyone else. Frank was elected board president in the special election that followed, running against one other candidate and winning by a wide margin. Under his leadership, Ashworth Green implemented a new policy requiring any HOA commission survey, mapping project, or boundary-related record to be independently cross-verified against official county recorded plats before being adopted as the community's official reference document, with mandatory individual notification to any homeowner whose property boundary showed even a minor discrepancy during that verification process. It was, in essence, exactly the safeguard that would have caught this entire situation 2 years earlier, before a single newsletter ever went out inviting residents to celebrate a trail running through land that wasn't the HOA's to use. My patio is still exactly where I built it, stone by stone all those summers ago. My pergola still stands over it, a little more weathered now, but solid. I added a small engraved marker near the edge of my property last year, mostly as a quiet joke with myself, noting the exact boundary line confirmed by Gregory's survey, though I suspect it'll outlast the joke and simply become one more small, permanent fact about where my land begins and where the community's begins beside it. I still see Priscilla most weeks. We've grown closer since all of this, in the strange way people sometimes do after going through something frustrating together. She jokes sometimes that I should charge admission for the story of how a stone patio ended a board president's 3-year run, though we both know it wasn't really about the patio at all. It was about how easily an entire community can be told something is true simply because it appears on an updated map, and how few people, myself included, would have ever thought to double-check that map against the original records if Karen hadn't walked into my backyard with a clipboard and a printout. Absolutely certain she was right. I think about that morning sometimes, standing on my own patio being told it wasn't mine, and how close I came to simply accepting it, the way I imagine plenty of homeowners might have, trusting that an official-looking document meant exactly what it claimed to mean. That's the part of this whole ordeal that stays with me the most. Not the meeting. Not the $62,000. Not even the moment Karen's composure finally cracked in front of a room of her own neighbors. It's the reminder that convenience and accuracy aren't always the same thing, and that the gap between them can sit quietly for years, right under someone's own feet, until the day someone finally decides to check. So here's what I keep coming back to, standing on that patio some evenings, looking out at the tree line beyond my own confirmed boundary. How many communities across this country are relying on maps, records, and assumptions that nobody has actually verified in years, simply because updating them once seemed easier than doing it, right? And how many of them are one clipboard, one printout, and one homeowner's old folder of paperwork away from finding out exactly how wrong those assumptions really are?